more for the CPN. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like us on Facebook.
This is how we know true love. Jesus gave his life for others. This is how we show true love. We should give our life for our brothers. He gave his life for you. He gave his life for me. He gave his life for you. He gave his life for me.
Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for another episode of the Christian Podcasting Network. I'm your host, David D. Gates, and with me this evening is Brother Roy Runyon, who has been on here a few times before. He's no stranger. How are you doing tonight, brother?
I'm doing just fine.
That's good. Guys, if you are just listening to one of these episodes for the very first time, you'll take note that at the bottom of the screen is the email address, the Christian Podcasting Network at gmail.com. If you have any questions about anything that is said during this program tonight, feel free to ask. If you would like to rebut anything that's said, we welcome that with open arms. If there's any way that we mishandle the scripture, we would love to take a look at that so we can be corrected ourselves. We're not claiming to be inspired. We are just students of the Bible, and we'd like to encourage you to get those things out right about now. And let's do some investigation. Let's do some study. Let's try to find more out about His Word so that we can be more apt to please Him. Now, brother, you recently had a debate live on Facebook. I'm going to let you fill in some of the shades of gray there. And if anybody wants the link to it, let me see, brother. Whenever this is over, could you send me the link to that, and I can. I guess if they have Facebook, they can just hit it and go straight into it from the YouTube link. And
Okay.
I don't know. Did y'all make it public?
I don't think he did. I think it's just shared in that group that full preterism, a thing of the past. I have the video downloaded on my computer, and I plan to upload it to my YouTube channel pretty soon. I just haven't had time yet with all the irons in the fire that I have. But anyway, hopefully that will be pretty soon, and my subscribers, of course, will receive a notification of that. I did recently in the group, in fact, I believe that was this morning, I posted, it's a long review, just hitting point after point after point, where he would say things, he would interrupt me, he would ignore things I said, he would ask me a question and interrupt me before I could even answer the question. But anyway, it's just a long, and it gives them the hour and minute so that anybody could go right straight to that, and and listen for themselves, make sure that I'm not misrepresenting Brother Aaron or Aaron. But anyway, yeah, this debate was Saturday a week ago, and the subject was the second coming of the Lord. Of course, I affirmed that it occurred in AD 70, and he denied. And I began with Isaiah's prophecies, and I began in chapter 2, because in chapter 2 is just about everybody agrees that this is talking about the first century. In Isaiah 2:2, that it'll come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house will be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow into it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, will walk in his paths, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now, as I grew up in the church, this was always read and presented and touted as being proof that the church was established in the first century, which, as I was brought up, they pointed to Pentecost, Pentecost Day. But the thing is, these two verses are the only thing that was ever read out of this entire text. And I mean, this is a block of prophecy. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 is all one block of prophecy. But I didn't know that because, I just listened to the preacher. He was, very convincing, and man, that sounds like the truth.
Right.
But anyway, when you look at verse 4, the very next word is and. And so we have a conjunction. So that means what he's about to say is in connection with what he has just said. So, if anybody's looking at the text, they see that it says he shall judge among the nations. So he's talking about a judgment here. And not, again, I'm not going to read all the text, but I laid down these facts right out of these scriptures. I read them in my opening argument. And you look at verse 10, and you see this phrase. Of course, he says, enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust. And then the phrase, for the fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. Verse 12 points out that it's the day of the Lord, okay? And then again, in verses 19 and 21, you have that exact same phrase again. They'll go to into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. It's repeated again in verse 21, like I said. And, I pointed out some other facts. When you look at chapter 3, you have famine mentioned here in verse 1. The people shall be oppressed, verse 5. And I pointed out, again, I'm not going to read all of these because it takes too much time. But in reading, and I encourage anybody that's listening to this broadcast, that they would read all of chapter 2, 3, and 4, and see the things that are predicted here. Again, chapter 3 and verse 14, the Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people. Okay? And then you come to chapter 4, and you keep seeing this phrase, in that day, which ties it all together. And in verse 2 of chapter 4, here is one of the huge points of this. He says, the branch of the Lord, in that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. So the prophet is saying here that some were going to escape this day of the Lord. And this would be when, verse 4, when the Lord will have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and have purged the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment. Okay? So, I presented these facts here. And I said that, in this text, we see that this was a day of judgment against Old Covenant Israel. And again, I pointed out, Aaron admitted that the Lord came in judgment against Israel in AD 70.
Right.
So, I mean, he had nothing to stand on as far as the rebuttal, because there's no question that that's what this is talking about. He admitted that the Lord came in judgment against Israel in AD 70. And the fact that, again, in verse 2, chapter 4, verse 2, them that are escaped, that fact proves that this day of the Lord prediction could not be an end of time prediction, because nobody would escape the end of time. I mean, that's just impossible.
So
okay?
you've got a kind of a three-way dilemma there. You've got the Lord's house being established the same day that judgment's being executed, and the same day that judgment's being executed and the Lord's house is being established, you have people escaping from the wrath, all in the same time.
Exactly. And it would be, well, it's martyr vindication. I didn't mention that. I didn't say those words in the debate, but that's what verse 4 is talking about, purging the blood of Jerusalem. And that fits perfectly with what Jesus said in Matthew 23, that all the righteous bloodshed upon the earth, all the way back to Abel, would be required of this generation, Jesus said, that generation of vipers that he was talking to. And then he immediately goes into the Olivet Discourse. So you have the martyr vindication here. in this same time frame. And then I went to the end of the book, chapters 65 and 66 of Isaiah. And again, because of time constraints, I couldn't actually get all the, a lot of the context, because if you'll back up, and you don't have to do this, I'm just going to say it. When you go back to Isaiah 60 and you read 60 and 61 and 62 and 63, you come through these, you find that the contextual time frame in this prophecy is when the Gentiles will come into covenant relationship with Jehovah, and God's people will be called by a new name. I mean, that sets the context, and that is irrefutably first century. That's the only event in the history of the entire planet that this could be talking about. And then when you come to chapter 65, there's phrases here I pointed out, like in verse 6, that he says, I will not keep silence, I will recompense, even recompense into their bosom. Again in verse 7, therefore will I measure their former work into their bosom. And a little later on in the debate, I pointed out how that Paul makes this statement to the Thessalonians about the Jewish persecutors. But anyway, when you come on down, you see here in verse 15 specifically, Isaiah 65:15, where Jehovah says, and you shall leave your name for a curse unto my chosen, for the Lord God shall slay thee and call his servants by another name. Well, again, when you back up and get the context, he's talking about the salvation of the Gentiles being brought into covenant relationship with God. And this would be the time that the Lord would slay thee, in King James here, this is referring to Judah. And verses 17 through 19 then, you have the creation of the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem. And in verse 19, the voice of weeping shall be no more heard in her, nor the voice of crying. That's resurrection. And then when you come on over into chapter 66, again, verse 4, I will also choose their delusions. Again, that's Paul references almost as verbatim, states that in 2 Thessalonians 2, where he said, God said, I'll send them a strong delusion that they all believe a lie and be damned. But the main thrust of what I was getting at, again, Isaiah 66 verse 12 says, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Okay, now in verse 15, he says here, for behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. And this phrase right here, with flames of fire, in the Septuagint, Paul quotes this phrase verbatim in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, when he said, the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven in flaming fire. It is this exact phrase right here in Isaiah 66 and verse 15 from the Septuagint, with flames of fire. Okay, so Paul quotes this text right here. And then as we look, okay, I'll go ahead and get this right here. He says in verse 8, Isaiah 66:18, for I know their works and their thoughts, it shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations. So again, we have the same thing repeated here as we seen in chapter 4. Okay, that some would escape this day of the Lord, this judgment here that he's talking about. And he says, I'll set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations. And he names some nations there: Tarshish, Pul, Lud, Tubal, Javan, and I'm guessing at the pronunciation of those. But anyway, and he says, the isles afar off that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. And then again, the new heavens, the new earth is mentioned here in verse 22. Again, this is just a repetition of the previous chapter, 65, the creation of the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem. He's still talking about the same thing. And it would be a day of the Lord in which he would come in flaming fire, Isaiah 66:15. And it would be a time when some would escape this day of the Lord, and that they would carry the gospel, the glory of the Messiah to the Gentiles. So again, this is absolute, categoric, irrefutable truth that this cannot be referring to the end of time. It cannot. Aaron's words were the end of all things.
Yeah.
And he just shrugged this off and said, well, I don't believe that's AD 70. I believe that it's talking about the end of all things. And never offered any proof whatsoever,
right,
to refute what I was pointing out here. So then when you go to and I hit on some other passages in the Thessalonian epistles, but the main thrust was 2 Thessalonians 1. And I pointed out how that, like in verse 4, 2 Thessalonians 1:4, so that we ourselves glory in you, in the churches of God, for your patience and faith in your persecutions and tribulations which you endure.
And brother,
I'm
not to cut over you too much, but whenever you look at a letter like this that is specifically addressed to someone, not you, and look, don't get me wrong, I try to encourage people to try to see themselves in the narrative. You know, it's good to try to see yourself in the narrative to a certain extent, or else, you know, who are we to even say that we have salvation at all if you can't see yourself in the narrative at all? But when you start looking at this here, and it talks about your persecutions and your tribulations, the ones that you endure, and it's written to a Thessalonian church 2,000 years ago, why can't we ever just let that ring a bell that we're not going through the same things they were going to, and that this is addressing something specifically they were living through?
Right, exactly. And the thing is, in verse 6, he says, seeing it is a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you. Okay, again, there's the three places I mentioned, I pointed out there in chapter 65 and 66 of Isaiah, where he said he would recompense to them. See, so again, Paul is pulling this thought from that, which, you know, I'll prove that in just a minute. But, you know, you notice the difference here. There's a contrast. And he, as you said, he's writing to these Thessalonian brethren here. They were being patient through the persecutions that they were enduring. And he says that it's a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you. So who was troubling the Thessalonians? Well, it was the Jewish persecutors. And you learn that from 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 15 and following.
Well, you also learn it from Acts too, brother. Whenever it shows firsthand, what was going on whenever they were traveling and preaching, and how the Jews caused such an uproar at the gospel being preached.
Exactly, and you go to Acts chapter 17, and it spells it out right there. Mm-hmm. That they run Paul out of town, and they even followed him to other places, causing havoc. But then he says, to you who are troubled, in verse 7, rest with us when. So here's a time statement. Paul is promising them rest or relief from their persecutions that they were enduring, when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire. Verse 8. There is the verbatim quote from Isaiah 66 that I mentioned. Okay, and he says, taking vengeance on them that know not God and that obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, which is them, shall be punished with everlasting destruction. Now notice this, from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. That is a verbatim quote from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 10, 19, and 21. Those three, I called it, for humor's sake, I called it the Isaiah trilogy that we see there. And Paul is quoting from two places. He's pulling two contexts from Isaiah into the reader's minds here, and both of those prophecies predict a day of the Lord judgment in which some would escape. And as you go on into chapter 2 here of 2 Thessalonians, then you see that they would escape. Actually, that's not the one I'm thinking. It's chapter 5 of the previous chapter, or previous epistle. I'm sorry. When you look at 1 Thessalonians 5, which immediately preceded the first chapter here that we read, he talks about how that they knew the day, the times and the seasons. There, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 1. And you remember Jesus, he said there in Acts 1, the disciples asked him, wilt thou at this time restore unto the kingdom unto Israel? And he said, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons. Well, apparently now it is time, because Paul says all the times and the seasons. That's the exact same phrase that you find in Acts 1. And he says, but of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. Okay, let's go on and read. For when they, again, you have the you brethren and they contrast here. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them. Notice who the destruction is going to come upon. Them. Okay, as travail, there's the messianic birth pangs motif right there. As travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. Well, see, they knew perfectly of the times and the seasons. And see, that was one of the things that Aaron asked me in the debate. I think he actually said specifically, did Paul know the day and the hour? And if you've not watched it already, you'll see that where I said, yes, he did. And if you'll let me prove it, I'll do that. And he never would. He went to 1 Corinthians 15 and read the entire chapter, trying to comment on it, and just consumed just about all the time. But right here's where I was going to go to show him that Paul and the Thessalonian brethren knew perfectly of the day of the Lord that comes as a thief in the night. And of course, then when you look at the day of the Lord that comes as a thief in the night that Paul is talking about here, then that's the day of the Lord that will come as a thief in the night that Peter is talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3. And Peter even went ahead and said that Paul spoke of all these things, or spoke of these things in all of his epistles. So Peter talked about the day of the Lord coming as a thief in the night. He said Paul wrote about him, and here's Paul talking about the day of the Lord coming as a thief in the night in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 2. And he said that you, brethren, you don't need for me to write this to you because of the times and seasons you know perfectly. And then he says that those that persecute them would, sudden destruction would come upon them. Okay. And again, you go back to chapter 2, and it's that's the Jewish persecutors. So he's talking about sudden destruction would come upon them, the Jewish persecutors, but the Thessalonian brethren would not, this destruction wouldn't come upon them, it wouldn't overtake them. That day wouldn't overtake them like a thief. They would escape. So, I mean, it fits perfectly with Isaiah 2 through 4 and chapter 65 and 66 of how Paul pulls these prophecies into view here, into the minds of the readers, and in predicting this day of the Lord in which some would escape. And it just absolutely cannot be an end of time, end of all things prediction, because nobody could escape the end of time.
So all that being said, and I agree with you, by the way, but all that being said, we've talked a lot about this debate, and my hotkeys wanted to mess up on me a little bit this evening, but I was going to.
Yes.
Now, again, since you have admitted to me personally that the Lord came in judgment against Israel,
About 2715, I believe.
finish that last sentence. Let me finish.
All right.
Since you have admitted to me personally that the Lord came in judgment against Israel in AD 70,
Of
and
course
since this was unquestionably the fulfillment of Old Testament predictions of the Lord coming in judgment at the day of the Lord, and
I did
both
not say
texts
that.
I've shown you, show me the text anywhere in the Bible that predicts another coming of the Son of Man in clouds of heaven in judgment outside that first century generation. So I had 22 minutes. Oh, yeah.
Man, I thought I said no opening statements. All right. All right. Well, let me start off by saying I do affirm that the Lord did come in judgment in AD 70. I don't think anybody here would deny that. I do agree there are time statements. Where I will disagree with Roy is this, and from his opening statement, I believe Isaiah 65 and 66 and 1 Thessalonians 2 are not speaking about AD 70, but are speaking about the end of all things. And I have reasons for saying that. First of all,
right.
Seen here. First of all, if you believe that the Lord came in judgment in AD 70, and he also went a step further to say, I don't think anybody here is going to deny that. Well, actually, I'm going to say that there's a whole lot of people that won't deny that. Do they understand the gravity of what they're saying whenever they say that? No, I think that's a completely different subject. Now, if you're going to say that Matthew 24 is AD 70, for instance, which I think he would agree with that statement if I'm not mistaken. How can you go from that to saying that's not, if you're going to say he came in judgment, then that was the day of the Lord, the coming of the Lord. I mean, how can you say he came then, but that's not the second coming? I mean, is that a 2.5 coming? Is that a, I mean, how do they even escape saying something like that?
Well, I don't know, and it's he made that admission to me in a phone call, and I told him right then. I said, "You don't know it yet, but you just handed me my argument. You know, you just confuted your entire position by admitting that."
Yeah.
And I mean, that's evident when you go through this entire video that he never had the first rebuttal for the things that I laid out. And I kept coming back all through the debate. I kept coming back to my original argument. And I wanted to go even further because there were some other points that I could make from those same texts that would tie other things together. But it just time constraints and everything, you know, I just couldn't do that. But yeah, I'm like you. In my brethren, what I call my brethren, you know, the ones who booted me out, one of them asked another brother to write a tract refuting the AD 70 doctrine. And this brother, you know, dearly beloved brother, he wrote a tract about Matthew 24. And on the first page, he said, "We are not living in an age of prophecy." I said, "All right, thank you. You just handed me my argument right there." because if we're not living in an age of prophecy, and we're not, then we can't be looking for a future return of Christ, because that's prophecy. I mean, there's no way around it.
All right. Yeah, and then you're gonna have at some point an inconsistency of physical and spiritual concepts. I know that they constantly want to say, or a lot of people want to constantly say literal, but I mean, again, I've said this a few times on here before, but I believe God's a literal God. He's still not physical. He's a spirit. It says in John 4, he is a spirit. So just because I believe something's spiritual does not mean that I take it to mean anything less literal. But we're probably going to get into some of that here too, but he told me that he is amillennial, if I remember that right. So amillennial, that's got a very good mixture of physical and spiritual concepts. They disagree with premillennial because of their use of the kingdom at hand, and then but you go get them and sit down with a premillennialist, and they're going to tell them to look at the time statements to prove that the kingdom had already was near, But one of the things he just said in the video right there was, and yes, there are time statements, but did he ever offer any verses to prove any of that, where somebody said that something was about to happen and it didn't happen for thousands of years? Can you just cite one verse in the Bible where anything like that was ever the case? And I don't see God's use of language to mean that. And so we're back to the previous podcast me and Brother John just had. If the bully on the playground says he's going to knock your head off at 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock comes and goes and the kid just gets a black eye, did he keep his word or not? I mean, so the timing of an event must determine the nature of it, and it must determine whether the person was using metaphoric language or not.
Right. Yeah, that's the point that I tried to make in trying to condense where he was wanting to read the entire 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Go to the climax. Go to Paul's climax right there in the last 3 or 4 verses, and look where he says, when the resurrection takes place, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written. And he quotes Isaiah 25 and verse 8, which Aaron just laughed at me and said Paul wasn't quoting Isaiah. But see, if we establish that the second coming occurred in our past, then that of necessity proves the nature of the resurrection.
Okay, I think we just had a hiccup. I've lost all sound to the brother. We've had this happen before, guys. Those of you who are listening here, just give me one moment and I will try to get him back on here. Okay. And refresh. And okay, are you there?
There you are.
Okay, I got him back, guys. Let me get this back up. But while we got the hiccup going on there, I'm gonna take that opportunity to go ahead and pull this this video back up. If y'all give me a sec.
Roy mentioned, and I'm going to be a little bit here because I'm building an argument here. I'm going off of what Roy had said on video. So this is exactly my point. He mentioned Isaiah 2, and in Isaiah 2, if we look in our Bibles, it says that in the last days, the nations will flow to Mount Zion. Well, according to Roy. And by the way, his argument there had a lot of assumptions. We had a lot of scriptures. I was looking at the scriptures. A lot of them weren't even saying what he necessarily said they were saying. These are all just assumptions that the full preterist puts there to try to build their AD 70 background, and I'm going to tear that apart in about hopefully 20 minutes. So I can let Roy talk again. But Isaiah 2 verse 2 says, in the last days, the nations will flow to Mount Zion. If we're no longer in the last days, then why is Roy or myself or any of us who are Gentiles here, why do we care about the gospel? Because apparently, in Roy's view, if the last days was then there's no need for the spreading of the gospel. It's finished. And I'm actually going to...
Okay.
So, to kind of rehash what he said right there, he says that if we're not in the last days, then all nations can't be flowing into the mountain of the Lord, into Mount Zion, into the mountain of the Lord's house, whichever way that's precisely worded there. Okay,
Right.
But the point's simple though. He's trying to say that if that's fulfilled, then it can't be happening today. Where do you want to? I'm sure you've dealt with this sort of thing a lot of times. How do you normally respond to something like that?
Well, what he is, what they're trying to do is, and maybe this is actually the way they think, is that when prophecy is fulfilled, then that means a terminus, or it stops. And see, he overlooked the main point that I made from Isaiah chapter 66, that those who would escape the day of the Lord would then go, they'd be sent to carry the gospel to the Gentiles, to the nations.
Mm-hmm.
It would continue on. And see, he a little bit later here, he tries to say, and he actually says that full preterists say that physical death exists in the new heavens and the new earth. And what he was searching for, and he finally found it there, was chapter 65, verses 20 through 25. And what he doesn't realize is that demonstrates the exact same thing as what I pointed out in chapter 66, that those who would escape the day of the Lord, they'd carry the gospel to the Gentiles. In 65, verses 20 through 25, that depicts a scene in which life goes on, you see, after the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. It doesn't say that sin and death exists in the new heavens. See, that's a straw man argument, and he totally misrepresented what we believe and what we teach when he said that full preterists assert that physical death would exist in the new heavens and the new earth. So yeah, and again, this was his main rebuttal was, well, I just said things the scriptures weren't saying, even though I read the scriptures verbatim. And that's what always amazes me. And I mean, it happens day after day after day in Facebook conversations. You quote a verse, well, that's just your interpretation of it.
Right.
No, I quoted the verse, but people, they don't know what to say.
Right.
Because here is a scripture that is confuting them, and they don't know what to say, other than to go off onto something. Well, that you're just putting assumptions in there, like that. And that's what he said.
Well.
So, Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if you look at the language in this verse as well, in addition to what you're saying, now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains. Now, if it's fair for him to say the comment that he did about there being no more salvation, allegedly, if the last days that it's speaking of here, the latter times that were being addressed are actually over, then there's no salvation. That's his statement. Well, if you can say that, then I can say that if the last days aren't passed, then you're not even part of the Lord's house because it hasn't been established yet. So what I'm saying is, you can easily take a piece of language and contort it to fit your agenda. We see it in politics all the time, But he knows as well as you know and as well as I know that all nations were not part of this house that was to be established yet, and it began in Judaism. And the law going forth out of Zion, where's it? Look, right here. Out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Well, if you're talking about a law going forth whenever the law was already sent forth from Sinai, a Jew reading this would have taken this to mean that there was going to be a new age, a new law, and they would have understood this probably more than people give them credit for at this point in history, this coming from prophet Isaiah. You know, they had a very good grasp, I believe, on what this law going forth would imply. They may not have had every little detail of it etched out, obviously, because of how they were trying to reconcile some of these words to Jesus. And it was put to me before that they had a couple of schools of thought. And, you know, the word ben means son of, you know, like Joseph ben David, for example, would be Joseph the son of David, right?
Right.
Well, you had your school of thought that was the son of Joseph, Messiah, the son of Joseph, Ben Joseph, and then you had the son of David, right? And you had two different thoughts there because they couldn't reconcile them. So obviously they had problems trying to figure out how to reconcile somebody suffering and being a victorious king at the same time, or in the same process, or however you want to term that. But I do believe that they understood that this Messiah was going to have his own law and that it was going to go forth from Jerusalem. Now,
whenever, and it would be in the last days.
And it had to be, yeah. And this is all taking place in the last days. And since that's the case, see, even though a person could convert from another nation into Judaism, what this is actually saying here is that this law was going to be for all nations. It had all nations in mind when it was written, type of language, not on tables of stone, right? But the point is simple. When you go back up here to verse number 2, and you start talking about all nations flowing into it, it's talking about at the point of its establishment. That does not mean that once it's established, people stop flowing into it. That's like the Isaiah 9:6 argument and saying that, let me scroll down a little bit. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. That's like saying that it can never be fulfilled because it has no end. I mean, I just don't think that's a good argument. I think you can make that type of argument even trying to argue against the Bible itself if you tried hard enough, and I just don't see that as logical reasoning.
Right. And it's another thing. This wasn't in the debate, even though he talked about the last days. We're in the last days, and see, they fight tooth and nail against the idea of a Jewish age and a Christian age, simply because that exact phrase is not found in one verse. But when you study, for instance, Joel chapters 2 and 3, and you look at the prophecies there of the harvest, that was predicted to be in the last days. And Peter, as everybody knows, Peter quoted Joel on the day of Pentecost. This is that was spoken by the prophet Joel, that it'll come to pass in the last days. So what Joel predicted to be in the last days, Peter said was in the last days, but Jesus quotes the same prophecy in the Olivet Discourse and applies it to the end of the age.
Right.
And that's where they're just totally confuted.
Right.
What Jesus said, that when that temple was destroyed, the disciples said, when will this be? What will be the sign of your parousia and of the end of the age? So when Jesus said the temple's going to be destroyed, they said, when's the end of the age going to occur? Okay, so why did they ask that? Why did they ask when would the end of the age be? And then why did Jesus go on and talk about the end? He said, this and this and this will happen, but the end is not yet. Then some more things are going to happen. And the gospel of the kingdom, or the gospel will be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Then shall the end come. So Jesus told that the only end under discussion was the end of the age. And so when I asked somebody what age came to its end when the temple fell, they're totally tore up. They can't answer it, and they start with deflections and so forth. But and even in the debate, I quoted that verse and I asked Aaron. I said, "Has that been fulfilled?" Well, he said no. Has the gospel gone into all the nations? Preached to witness to all nations. He said no. So I read all. There's 5 passages in which Paul says 6 times that mission had been accomplished. Romans 10:18, Romans 16:26, Colossians 1:6, Colossians 1:23, and Titus 2:11. 6 times Paul says that mission had been accomplished. I read those to him. I came back and I quoted that verse again. The gospel shall be preached in all the world for a witness in all nations. Then shall the end come. I said, did the end come like Jesus said? He said, no.
Yeah, I saw him stumbling over the words "last day," and if he listens to this, I hope he'll take the time to. I can't remember what episode it was, but I did an entire podcast on that one Saturday morning, and it's hard to look at the words of Jesus here, number one, and confuse that he's addressing Antiochus Epiphanes in Daniel 12 when Jesus is quoting from Daniel 12 and saying that those things are yet future. So look, if we're going to suggest to you that there may have been a misunderstanding of the language somewhere that's in the text, then you might want to listen, because Jesus says, no, that's yet future. But how you can go somewhere where Jesus is quoting from 3 times, 4 times, I can't remember, and maybe even alluded to it even more times than that, where there's a specific number of days given in the text, and in which Daniel's also told in the end of those days. What days? Well, the days that's in the text. Why not ever consult other passages where numbers of days are listed until certain events are supposed to take place? Whenever something says last day, why does it always have to mean the end of the world? And what in the text demands that be the interpretation, when there are obviously other texts which need to be addressed and proven that it can't mean those number of days? See, that's the problem we get into hermeneutically when we're looking at things. We have such as heavens and earth. He admitted in the debate that there's other uses of the words heavens and earth in the Bible, and that's awesome, and that's one of the reasons I'm trying to take a lot of time to see exactly what he believes, and not just come out swinging like I'm against him or something like that. And you don't even know what a person believes. It's hard to sit there and how in the world am I going to disagree with you? I don't even know what you believe. But whenever you establish that there are other uses of words in the Bible, you can't just assume identity to one of those words without fully examining them, especially when you're sitting there admitting that there's other uses of the word. And that's got to be the case whenever you come to words like last day. Daniel had done a whole lot of studying in his life, and he wanted to know when things were going to take place. And whenever you consider that into the equation, you got Jesus quoting from it. Now you've got yourself an issue, because now you've got to prove that the end of the days, the 1290 days and so forth of Daniel 12, is not the same end that Jesus is referencing in Matthew 24. And given the number of times he quotes from Daniel 12 there, that is simply something you cannot do.
Yeah. See, another thing I pointed out was, and that's one of the places I wanted to go was to Daniel, and again, just didn't have time. But Jesus quotes from Isaiah 2 in Luke chapter 23, and I'll turn there too so I can put my eyes on it. In Luke chapter 23 and verse 28, this is where Jesus was carrying his cross to Golgotha, and women were following and lamenting and bewailing, they're crying. And in verse 28, it says that he turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for who? Yourselves and your children. Why? For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bear, and the paps which never gave suck. Then," time statement, "then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to hills, cover us."
To
so,
who?
Again, yeah. And he's quoting, well, maybe not quoting, but he's citing or alluding to Isaiah 2, verses 10, 19, and 21. He's quoting that prophecy, and he is applying that to the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, there's no question about this. And then to say that Paul quotes the same passage and gives it an entirely different application is just specious. And it's desperation is what it is, because he just didn't have an answer. He just ended up laughing at me and saying Jesus and Paul wasn't quoting from Isaiah.
Well, before we still got a few more minutes left here, brother, before we get on out of here.
All right. Yes, tell me where at. Okay. Okay.
Show some stuff in scripture, because Roy had mentioned the new heavens and the new earth. So let's go to 2 Peter 3, which the full preterist loves to say is 80-70. I will disagree. There's a lot of places I want to go. My mind is just like going off with things I want to say. I hope I can organize this as good as Roy organized his thoughts, as much as I disagree with his thoughts. Let's look at 2 Peter 3. So we're talking new heavens and new earth. Actually, first problem, in Isaiah 65, Roy, and you forgot to mention this, there's death in the new heaven and the new heavens and the new earth. That's part of your argument, is it not?
Yes.
Why we could be in the new heavens and the new earth, because there's death in Isaiah 65. Is that correct?
Would you repeat that, please?
Do you believe there's death in the new heaven and the new earth in Isaiah 65? That's
No,
talking about literal death. What?
I missed part of that.
Do you believe that?
I missed part of what you said. There's some lag time.
Do you believe that in the new heavens and the new earth in Isaiah 65 it speaks about physical death?
I may reserve that for later.
But is that a yes or a no?
I may reserve that for later.
Okay. Well, the full preterist will assert that. Now, my problem is if you look at the verse, and I have to find it. It says, I create a new heavens and a new earth. Behold, I will extend peace to a river like a river, and the glory of Gentiles like a flowing stream. But when it talks about death, and I can't really find the verse right now. Oh wait, no, I went all the way to Isaiah 65, 66. I went all the way to 66. Okay, look, no more shall an infant from there live but a few days, nor an old man has not fulfilled his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. So, Roy, here's my question. Do you agree then the new heavens and the new earth, there's no curse for the believer?
You want me to answer now, or you want to keep going?
I want you to answer. All right, well, we'll save that argument for later, because Roy doesn't want to answer that. Now, I'm gonna go to 2 Peter 3, because I was getting to a point there, but anyway, so we're talking about new heavens and new earth here. And
Okay.
He asked if you would agree that in the new heavens and new earth there was no curse, and he was trying to refer that to a physical death. But see, in his mind, he thinks that physical death is the curse. And so I think that's where he was trying to go with that, because in his mind, if there's no curse, there can't be physical death. But I think the language in itself identifies that if there is no curse, then it can't be addressing physical death.
Yeah, that's why
I mean, my bad. It must be addressing. I said that wrong. Sorry about that. If there is no curse and there is physical death, then the curse can't be physical death, because otherwise that would be a contradiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I meant. I wanted to come back to those verses, Isaiah 65, 20 through 25. I wanted to come back to that later, to where I could address it and tie it together with Isaiah 66, and show how that it was synonymous. So that's I was reserved in what I said there. Plus, we had the lag time, and if I started to say something and he said something, it blotched it out because of the lag time, and a lot of times I would miss quite a bit of what he said. But it would be interesting for anybody who would want to watch this video all the way through, to watch his body language and watch how much attention he is paying to the comments that's coming through on his phone. I think that he had 3 monitors, not monitors, but he had a phone. He had another thing, something that was having comments come up on it. And then he had even another one. He had an iPad, looked like, because he picked it up at one time and typed on it and laid it back down. So I think I told somebody, I believe I was debating 3 people, just kind of jokingly, because I know there was one time in specific reference to, I made a point, asked him a question or something, and he was just totally dumbfounded by the point that I made until his phone buzzed. And he looked down at it and he immediately gave a response and diverted off to another subject. So he just, and that's why a lot of the times that I would be reading a text, making a point, and he wasn't paying attention to what I was saying. And there was one time that I did that, and then he said, "Hey, what are you talking about? Would you read that verse again?" And I mean, it's obvious he wasn't. He looked at his comments. He started writing down something from somebody that sent him a comment, and and I had to read the passage again for him.
Right.
So he just he didn't pay very much attention to what I was saying, I wanted him to read these passages with me, and very little he did of that. And of course, again, that's obvious. Anybody that watches the video can see that.
Right. Well, I want you to just try to remember to upload that to your channel, because I mean, I'm not completely done with it, but I sat here this evening. I watched a pretty good bit of it, and I intend on finishing it as well. But there were some things that I wanted to start to bring up, and there's so many more that we could. Matter of fact, the next thing he was fixing to touch on was 2 Peter 3. In fact, I called into the Gospel Broadcasting Network one night, and I just basically asked them that hermeneutic, because they were talking about the heavens and the earth and the fire and so on and so forth. And you know, in Hebrews 9, we've addressed this before on here, how you know, the image of the heavens, not the heavenly things themselves, it comes on out and tells you that that's the temple typology, that's exactly what that is. It says it in language that you can't deny. Well, what do you do? What do you do with language like that once it's been established? And that's basically what I asked them on the Gospel Broadcasting Network, without getting into too much of a debate. I asked them if they felt that it was necessary, once something's been shown to have more than one definition, if they should prove it, and they said yeah, they feel that they should. But in the broadcast they were having, they weren't attempting to prove that. They were, you know, well, it's obviously saying this, so that means that, and that was just the end of it. We can't do that with language, and that's one of the encouragements that I want to give y'all, is to try to be diligent to try to go the extra mile to learn different meanings of words in different ways that they're used in the Bible, because when you start doing this, you're going to be on a never-ending roller coaster for the rest of your life, and you're going to constantly learn, unlearn, like Brother OB says, learn, unlearn, and relearn things in the Bible. And you know, at the end of the day, I keep coming back to this same point. I keep thinking about Paul, who was talking about, you know, if he's trying to excel to achieve the righteousness of Christ, and then he be found a sinner, does Christ become the minister of sin to him? No, he don't. We've been given grace to grow. If our perfection was the basis whereby we approach God, then we wouldn't need Jesus. We're not all going to have perfect understandings in the Bible. We're not all going to agree. And I think the thing there is to work together to try to achieve this better knowledge, to try to understand His will. Let's not be so bigoty toward one another, and keep walls of divisions up, and make new parties and new cults and new denominations, and just rejoice in the fact that we disagree on all these various things. And let's sit at a round table, break out our Bibles, and study together, and let's start with the foundation, which is Jesus Christ, and move forward from there. Because we're always going to disagree on things, but it's a lot easier to try to work on a verse with two people than one, and so on and so forth. So, brother, we've had a pretty good session on here tonight. I got an hour and 4 minutes. I do want to thank you for being willing to come on here once again.
Well, it's the pleasure's mine. I really appreciate the work that you're doing through this podcast network, and giving brethren the opportunity to come on with you and to talk and to study and to share ideas and so forth. And it's I really appreciate the work.
Well, I appreciate you, brother. And don't forget, guys, if you have questions, comments, ideas, concerns, if you want to submit them in to the Christian Podcasting Network at gmail.com, it's right there on your screen. Write it down, submit those videos. I can incorporate videos into the podcast if you'd like to just ask the question however you'd like to ask it, whatever you'd like to ask. I'm not going to try to not let you ask the question unless it's just something really just having nothing to do with the Bible or something. We'd be glad to especially if I don't know the answer to it. You know, it'll make me try to go search for answers. We might have to get Zoom on here, have 5, 6, 10 brothers try to answer something, you know. Try us, you know. But I want to thank y'all for y'all's time and for y'all's attention. The things that we go through daily are not going to be easy. We're going to have troubles no matter where we turn. But wouldn't it be nice to have hope on our last breath? Wouldn't it be nice to know in faith that we have eternal life? If you'd like to learn more about that, if you'd like to learn more about that, I'd like to reference you to episodes numbers 1 and 2. You can look those up. We address the logic of God, the evidence of the Bible, and what must I do to be saved in some pretty good length. If you got more questions about that, I'm sure you could ask either me or Brother Roy, and we'd be happy to talk with you more about that. This has been episode number 39, guys. Before you know it, we'll be at 100, Lord willing. The number keeps getting greater and greater, and I just want to thank you guys. Keep your heads up, and if it don't happen good with you, then let it work good in you, just like I always say. This is episode number 39 of the Christian Podcasting Network. I'm David D. Gates, and I'm out.